Hi, moderator. I just turned on my mic. It's easier to talk than to type in the chat. I'm here with on my iPad. So I have my laptop here and I will type the minutes of this meeting directly to a Google Docs document, which I got beforehand.
Oh, hi, that sounds great.
Okay. Anything else you need to know?
I don't think so. No, I was just saying hi. Nice to meet you.
Okay, nice to meet you too. Bye.
All right, bye.
Maria, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good.
Thanks for your help with the notes.
Yeah, hi. I hope today it will last the entire session. I'm so sorry, Jan, about yesterday.
No, well, there was nothing you could do. Someone suddenly used the facility, and that was, yeah.
Yeah, so I have the meeting notes for the second session open now, so I will type it again directly to the Google.
That's fine. That's fine.
And I'm still working on, or I had less time than I thought this afternoon. So the session notes from yesterday, I'll still work on that. So you'll have them.
Yeah, good.
Hey, Jan, it's me again, Ria. Would it be possible to copy paste that document into our shared notes before we start?
Yeah, it would. It is already in the Google Docs folder. You should be able to. It's this document here.
Okay.
Can you find it?
Yeah. Thanks.
Good. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Working Group 5, our second session. Again, we are Thorstein Gundersen, Peter Schlosser, and myself as co-chairs for the session. Before we start, there is from our chat monitor a small message, but I should also remember that today, in addition to the co-chairs, Ria Adams will take notes for us. I believe the chat monitor is Jen Jones and our tech person is Rosanna Mayfield. Is that correct? Otherwise, please tell us your names.
Good morning, I'm Jen Jones and I'm the chat monitor, so I'll be monitoring the chat today. Jean-René, would you like, there's a script that we're to read. Yeah. Would you like me to read this now? So good afternoon, good morning. I'm talking to you from Whitehorse, Yukon. So we're just asked to read this script that the circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different Indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize that these lands and waters are mostly unceded traditional homeland to the Indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the Indigenous people and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let's engage in open-minded community building collaboration as described by the ASSW Code of Conduct, and I'll share that in the chat window. And so there's some logistics I'd just like to share with people. I'm sure many of you have been part of this before. So you've joined with your camera off and your audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any times, please remember to remute yourself after speaking. You can mute yourself by pressing *6 if you're on the phone. And if you do not have a dedicated button. And so the reason we're muting ourselves is just so we don't hear, everyone else doesn't hear your typing or your conversations. And it also, to avoid the echo, if you have the option, please use your headphones or a headset. If you are on the phone, please turn your computer speakers all the way down. We can get an echo when your phone picks up that computer audio. For those who are not familiar with Zoom, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you will see a variety of icons, and you can either unmute yourself there, you can start your video there, or you can turn your video off. If you have questions during the presentation or the meeting here, you can type into the chat box, and you can access the chat box again by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see participants, the word manage participants, that will show you the list of participants, and also chat. I will monitor the chat. So if you're having some audio difficulties, I can relay your questions to the rest of the group. This is particularly useful for folks without a mic. The presentation is recorded. Again, I will put the link in the chat box. And I think that's all I have to say. And I'll pass it back on to Jean-René. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Like yesterday, I would like to propose that each of the participants introduce themselves by writing just a line of their name and affiliation in the chat box. And that reminds me, because what happened yesterday, we were not able to save the chat, but I guess that is an option, and we would, if that is possible, we would like that to happen after the session. Jen, you will be able to help us with that?
I can try. I will figure that out as we move along.
Thanks a lot. What happened during the session yesterday was that we, by an accident, were interrupted, and the session stopped, and we actually stopped in the middle of Wodikanitsu WMO presentation, and that's why we've asked her to redo the presentation, because we believe that that some of the important things that she was to share with us would come towards the end of that presentation. So we've decided to ask her to redo the presentation, but perhaps with less focus on, say, the first half of the presentation. So Rodika, if you are with us, if we can ask our tech help to make sure that your screen is shared.
Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, I'm here. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to share the second half of the presentation together with a brief overview of the earlier part. I guess
Probably have to press stop share then.
Okay. So as I mentioned yesterday, there are two aspects that I want to introduce, which are relevant from our perspective to the roads process. And these are the rolling review of requirements and the WMO integrated global observing system, which have a number of common elements with SAON and the proposed roads process. I mentioned yesterday that actually WMO is a facilitator. Members own and operate the infrastructure required for providing weather, climate, water, environmental services. And WMO facilitates the establishment of standards and provides guidance and plays an important role in supporting the development of policy. I introduced yesterday the work of WMO together with the World Bank on valuing weather and climate, which has as a goal identifying the value chain from observations to societal benefits and the intermediary steps, and this in the context of the goal to Arctic to benefits. The rolling review of requirements process of WMO addresses the two initial components in the delivery of benefits to society, and these are the observational requirements directly linked to the applications that the observations are supported. WMO has 14 applications, 15 now. It's a living list of 15 application areas and two cross-cutting themes, cryosphere being one of them. And each of these applications identify their requirements for data and are supported of guidance, which provide an assessment of the adequacy of observing systems and available observations to fulfill the requirements for those applications. And as you can see, it goes from weather-related numerical weather prediction to hydrology, climate science, climate applications, and climate monitoring, which is basically the application of GCOS. And I'll come back to GCOS given their essential climate variables, which are relevant to the process of establishing essential Arctic variables. As I mentioned, applications are actually the reference to which the observational requirements are established in WMO. The WMO integrated global observing system has been developed from the global observing system, which supported the World Weather Watch of WMO for many years. But the needs, the multiple needs at societal level require the inclusion of observations of the physical system, in addition to atmosphere, observations of atmospheric composition, cryosphere, hydrosphere. And WIGOS has been developed to address the needs, recognizing the diversity of operators and the diversity of observing systems, and with a goal of addressing scarcity of resources and scarcity of observations through coordination and optimization of observing systems. The goal in the end, and this is where it's actually important to recognize the link between observational requirements and applications. In the WMO context, the goal is to enable the access to data in a standardized format. So the standardized data representation, the metadata, together with best practices in terms of establishing the networks, monitoring best practices to ensure the compatibility and interoperability at data level. This is extremely important, especially in the real-time data access and data exchange applications, which are relevant, for example, for disaster preparedness and response, or on weather and climate, which are actually two of the societal benefit areas identified in the assessment framework that was done under the leadership of SEAR. So I was mentioning yesterday that these requirements are captured within a tool, the Observing Systems Capability Analysis and Review tool, also or better known as OSCAR. It includes the requirements for observed physical variables. And these are documented in terms of uncertainty, stability, resolution, observing cycles, timeliness. The same database has an assessment of or a summary of capabilities, existing current capabilities in terms of surface-based networks and or observing systems, as well as space-based. I think this database is actually useful, could be useful to the roads process, although it has a global focus, and in some in many areas the Arctic focus is not at the level would be necessary. But I trust that the engagement in the roads process could complement the gaps, or could address the gaps of it in the OSCAR database, as well as address the needs of Arctic communities for specific observations and meeting specific societal needs. I just want to show an example of how this, how each of the observed variables are documented in the database. Here I have the example of snow water equivalent. As you can see, the snow water equivalent is relevant to 10 application areas. And at the bottom, as you can see, are the specific requirements by application. You can see, I updated this slide. You can see that 3 different applications have 3 different requirements. They are listed in terms of threshold, which is the minimum requirement for data to be useful, the goal, which is the ideal requirement, and the breakthrough, which is the optimum, where the optimum application performance cost is met. And in general, the goal is to deliver application data from observed variables at the breakthrough level. I mentioned about the observing capabilities, and the OSCAR Surface database is the official repository of metadata for all surface-based stations. Currently, the database has mostly stations operated by meteorological services, and some of the stations over the ocean, which are monitored through the JCOM system, which is a IOC UNESCO WMO established monitoring system. OSCAR surface has the capability to store and offer the opportunity for discoverability of observations of technically an infinite number of stations, and it really takes the collaboration of the international community to fill in the data to make it then available to anyone wanting to find out where and which observations are available. And here is just a quick example. I did a bit of search on which sea ice stations are currently in OSCAR. And as you can see, there are a few, mostly ice buoys in the Arctic Ocean. And I drilled down on one of them randomly. You can see here on the right side of the screen, a screenshot of how the information about the station is captured in terms of location and some other characteristics which are up to the proponent to be filled or not. And here is the continuation of the page on this site and on any other site, which describes the observing program, the program affiliation. And you see here the International Arctic Buoy Panel station from US and the observed variables. And in this case, you can see just sea ice temperature and atmospheric pressure. Although a sea ice buoy, the system is still imperfect. Most of the sea ice variables are not included in OSCAR yet. Is something that we are working on and likely will be available by the end of this year. This has given you an overview of the activities that are relevant to the roads process in WMO. And the next few slides, I'm going to give a bit of assessment of the observing requirements process in WMO, that from GCOS, and some examples of the observing networks that are operated within the framework of WMO and which are relevant for the Arctic activities. So in the context of establishing, defining essential Arctic variables, Sandy mentioned about complementarity and integration. And I think these are two very important concepts, recognizing that once established, they would become tools to be used by a diverse community. So it's very important to identify what will be the purpose. And this in the context of the experience in WMO, where the focus is on observed variables. They are defined in a technology-free language, recognizing the need, but not the source of observation. But in the end, the observing requirements have been developed to support the development and sustainability of observing systems, which in turn are there to support identified applications to provide the needed services and so on. In the GCOS framework, the essential climate variables are a mixture of physical variables or groups of linked variables. And in many cases, there could be products that are derived from in situ and space-based and even model output variables. And the goal is to contribute to characterizing the Earth's climate. So while, and we've had internally in WMO numerous discussions on the difference in definition of variables in terms of observed versus variables in the context of essential climate variables. And one of the important recommendations for the process is about establishing a clarity before embarking on the definition of essential Arctic variables, because common language is critical. In the WMO database of observing requirements, there are a large number of variables. I don't have the exact number, but they are hundreds. While in the GCOS framework, there are 54 variables, and you probably know they've initiated a review process at the beginning of 2020, which is supposed to be concluded in 2022. But the ability to refer to use terminology that is understood in the same way by different communities, especially when the communities are so diverse as is the SEON community, and then the users of the outputs of SEON, is paramount to being successful. I have here an example of for CIs. In GCOS, CI-CCV is one variable. It's defined through 4 products: CI's concentration, extent, thickness, and drift. In the WMO observing requirements database, for example, thickness and extent are actually variables. And yeah, it has created some confusion within our communities. And this is just a quick example of how the CI surface characteristics, in this case, are actually identified as one variable in the WMO database. Sandy mentioned yesterday and in the opening remarks the need for clarity and the need for expanding the existing requirements to meet evolving needs. And in particular, CIs, which is so relevant for the Arctic activities, currently being defined primarily from a global climate perspective, requires a more in-depth look. The operational CI services, which are focusing on maritime safety, weather, marine pollution response, and search and rescue, rely on information distilled from raw data, but this information is required in a more timely manner. It requires a higher resolution. I said timely delivery and availability in the summer months. For example, the adoption recently of the IMO Polar Code, the international code for shipping, for ships operating in polar waters, has highlighted the need for information on ice conditions, on rapidly changing and severe weather conditions, which all require access to data in real time. And obviously the work in the roads process will address these needs, which today from an application perspective are to some degree addressed in the ocean applications as defined in WMO, but not to the level that would deliver the benefits as identified in the assessment process conducted by SEO. Now I have two slides with, which briefly introduce networks operated by WMO in addition to the traditional meteorological observing systems, and which are relevant to the work of this community. The first one is the Arctic HICOS, which is a project aimed at improving the monitoring of freshwater fluxes into the Arctic Ocean. And its goal is to support better climate prediction in the Northern Hemisphere. The data will be available through the global runoff dataset. And you see on the left upper corner a depiction of the network, and then the link to the website is available as well. On the right bottom corner is a map of the global map of the Global Cryosphere Watch Network. It's the newer program of WMO with the goal of facilitating the integration and the access of data, cryosphere data from multiple sources on snow, glacier, permafrost, sea ice, lake, river ice, ice sheets and ice shelves. The network that you see here today is actually has been evolving. Right now, the stations are not registered in the OROSCAR surface database, but they will be. In addition to developing the network, the core contribution of Global Cryosphere Watch consists in the development and basically the integration of best practices from the broader global community on monitoring, on observations, as well as developing or contributing, and there is a close engagement with the Arctic Data Committee on the development of metadata and data representation guidelines and standards to enable the access, the interoperability of different data sources to enable access to a large data set through and allow aggregation and the needed transformation for additional products. So on this slide, I have a snapshot from representing the January 2020 station availability or data availability in the global ocean observing system as it's available from JCOM Ops. As I mentioned, is a monitoring system established by IOC and WMO, and they provide a summary of and the monitoring of observing over oceans and additional products and additional reports on the availability of data. And we are working currently with them to address the gaps in standards on data and metadata for observations related to sea ice. Here I have Again, the Global Atmosphere Watch, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The GO program engages a broad community. It relies heavily on voluntary commitments from mostly scientific community, and in this sense is quite similar to the Global Cryosphere Watch, and the same as the activities in SEON. Its goal is long-term monitoring and scientific validation at global level, but it has a focus on monitoring several Arctic contaminants as well. And within its scope are the monitoring of greenhouse gases, reactive gases, aerosol, mercury, and so on. On the left side, I included one of the flagship projects of WMO for the polar regions, the year, actually the Polar Prediction Project that started about 8 years ago. And one of the activities is the year of polar prediction. This is a very relevant activity because among its objectives are the recommendations on improving the polar observing system, and with the goal of providing good coverage of high quality observations and in a cost-effective manner. So the year of polar prediction will wrap up in about 2 years, and the conclusion of the Polar Prediction Project coincides with a period of time when the roads process will be unfolding. And there is a lot to be learned from YOP, from PPP, in the process of defining the essential Arctic variables, defining characterizing those variables. And I believe that many of you are already involved with it, but I encourage this community to take into account the outcomes of PPP as it will provide a view in the future. So how can roads take advantage of what has already been done in WMO? First of all, we believe that in the context of WMO and its component, the WIGOS components, whether it's on monitoring of cryosphere, of hydrosphere, of atmospheric composition or atmosphere, they are very relevant resources for roads, and each of these components of the WIGOS will have a lot to learn from the outcomes of the roads process. Several aspects where WMO could contribute, could play a role, and are relevant for the applications, for the societal benefits expected to be delivered, are related to timeliness. And I mentioned earlier, the availability of near real-time data becomes critical for those applications and for those societal needs where real information in near real time is needed and response in real time is needed. The sustainability of observations. In general, many of observations in the polar regions come from projects with limited time scope, and long-term observations are necessary. So the question is how to find the balance between the challenge in securing funding for long-term observations, which usually assume operational programs, and still the multitude of research projects. The optimum design or finding the right balance between the use of in situ and space-based observations. Given the sparsity of observations in the Arctic, it is unlikely that more in situ observations would be possible on the long term. So it's really a great opportunity to look at the balance between the two and seeing on how to utilize the available space-based observations which are becoming available and how useful they are for different circumstances. The integrated requirements, and we've learned this in WMO, that in the end we have one observing system, but a multitude of applications. How to find that happy medium where multiple needs could be met with one observing system. The interoperability of at data level of data from multiple providers, and WMO has had a long-term experience in developing standards. Some of the traditional standards are not necessarily that useful to the scientific community. However, there is an understanding now that playing a role in the governance, for example, of the CF convention and supporting the broader use of NetCDF as a format. It's an activity that we are in process of preparing for and undertaking it. The discoverability of existing observations, this was mentioned yesterday, and this is where the OSCAR surface, for example, as well as the OSCAR requirements, the space-based capabilities are tools already in existence. They are not perfect, but are perfectible with common effort, but they are excellent tools for taking the first step in identifying which observations are where, and then going through the other steps to access and utilize the data. And I would like to close by on this list by calling upon this community to consider the registration of existing observations through the OSCAR surface to take the first step in sharing and acknowledging that observations exist more broadly. And the last slide is on additional relevant initiatives, and from the white papers, they are all very promising and with a lot of useful initiatives. And the fall, I selected the sustaining permafrost observations in terms of priorities and needs of the GTNP network, because permafrost is not, well, in the paper, the focus is on the interest in permafrost data from a climate perspective. There is increasingly strong interest on permafrost data of sufficient resolution for the implementation into hydrological models for the Arctic. And this is only to reiterate the commitment to from the Global Cryosphere Watch to work with GTNP to advance some of the aspects related to interoperability of existing data systems like the one the GTMP operates and GCW operate, as well as documenting best practices and supporting the development of permafrost and sustaining permafrost observations in general. And with this, thank you.
Thank you, Odika, for this very impressive overview of the WMO approach. I'm very impressed by the structure and the processes that you have set up, and also the invitation to the Roach process to make use of the way you organize your processes. I believe that a number of questions have been raised in the chat box through the session, so I think we should take these. Jen, will you help us?
Yes, I will. I just had to get my unmute. So we'll start off with Miko. Do you want to go ahead, Miko?
Okay, thank you very much, Radhika. I was really going for the, let's say, very practical aspect that you pretty much answered in a way that you are hoping that research networks would also kind of fill in the information into the OSCAR system. I do see that we have certain kind of network gathering places around already from the research side, so it might be actually there's a need maybe to just couple them together and make something jointly, because I don't see that there's so much interest necessary from one party that has set up something to fill it into the other side. But I think it's really good already. You in a way answered in your presentation later on my question already. But please comment on the thing of how OSCAR could be kind of connected, combined with already existing research network station information.
That's quite possible, and through machine-to-machine interfaces, actually the information from existing networks could be uploaded in OSCAR, such that the stations are viewable through the OSCAR interface, but then the link is established to the respective database that handles the full complement of information on that station. So it's sufficient to establish a link between the database of that respective network with OSCAR. And this is feasible through a machine-to-machine interface with specified and minimum number of fields, like the name of the station, the coordinates, and so on. I don't know if this answers your question, but we can discuss the specifics offline.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was good.
Miko, you had several comments. Is that, can I move to someone else, or did you have some other questions that you wanted to take at this point? Or
No, I think let's go on to ours. This one question was actually from Jay to me, which I commented on, so
okay,
leave it in the chat.
Okay, and Jay, I noticed that you had, was that a specific, you had a question to everyone? Did you want to ask that question at this point?
Yeah, this is Jay Perlman. I would like to ask the question. The presentation, which was an excellent presentation, mentioned best practices a number of times, but in the list of the particular thing, how can roads take advantage, etc., of the view graph just a couple back, data repository and access was mentioned, but there was no mention of should we be collecting best practices for Arctic observations, and if so, how can we do that so they're readily accessible to the broad community?
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's actually a very good point, and I mentioned when I spoke about the global cryosphere watch in particular. But each of these networks, each of these networks collects and publishes and maintains. And I think this is one of the key elements that I want to stress out. It maintains sets of best practices for observing the specific variables. And those are published by WMO. There is a publication, WMO number 8, it's called Guide to Methods of Instruments and Methods of Observation. For example, the cryosphere, the measurement of cryosphere variables is a volume 2 in this guide. But and I can speak for cryosphere because that's actually the one that I'm responsible for. When documented, it represents, it collects the input from the broader community. For example, for meteorological observations, the community is very much within the traditional base of WMO, the meteorological services. For cryosphere, this is not possible. There are no cryosphere observations that much to speak of within the meteorological community. So we have reached out to various other communities. And for example, GTMP is one of the recent partners with whom we started the documentation of best practices. But that's something very much at the core of the type of facilitation that WMO offers to the international community. And again, I want to stress out the maintenance, the fact that once established and published, there is a regular cycle of engagement with experts to update, review, enhance the practices. So once maybe the process to establish, to document and publish seems a bit longer because of the consultations that take place, but once such a publication is available, it benefits from the sustainability from WMO in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely, yes, if I omitted to mention it, it's definitely something that we are very much welcoming the community to contribute to the development where it doesn't exist, to the review, and something that definitely we need to work together on.
We have a question from Eric right now. And Jay, I didn't ask if you had more comments, but maybe I'll just go to Eric and then I'll circle back to you.
Mm-hmm. That'd be fine.
So Eric.
Thank you. And thank you, Rudika, for a very nice presentation. I think it was interesting to note that how well your presentation complement the one I gave yesterday and also the one Molly gave. And maybe it's not so surprising because we are representing operational organizations, all of us. But I think it raises the question that we are going to discuss in this working group on the input to roles and especially definition of essential variables. Maybe it's a little delaying factor because there are users that need data in the Arctic region. So maybe we should rather focus on how to design an observation network based on the existing knowledge we have of essential variables and raise the questions on, say, some of what you have also showed in the OSCAR database or what I showed for the Copernicus one yesterday, that there is an issue on resolution, definition of resolution in time and space, and then also the timeliness of data, or whether this gridded format is the right one, or whether we should maybe focus more on concentrated observations on specific phenomena and so on. So I would like that, or I would like to suggest that SAN maybe consider in the ROADS process to step a little further ahead and try to go into the design phase, because we know that there are organizations that are crying for data now. WMO, the meteorological organizations, need data in order to improve their forecasting skills. We do the same thing in Copernicus and so on. So that would be an issue for discussion, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I second your views, Eric. And indeed, I felt after you and Molly spoke that, yeah, well, it's like we planned the presentations together. I raised a point about the recently adopted Polar Code, and this is where the need for real-time data is basically now, because the requirements for services to ships navigating in the Arctic are now, and these are binding requirements. So the development of, for example, warnings and so on in the Arctic are not there, but they need to develop fast to meet this requirements. So, and on the other hand, it's really difficult to expect that changes in the observing systems will occur as a result of the review process, but actually looking at how to make data available and which data is mostly available needed with priority, I think it's in tall order. Thank you.
Can we go to Vito, please? You can go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the whole process. It's clear that WMO is an organization that putting together all the meteor services, hydrological services, is able to provide a huge amount of data, and you are presented, Radhika, very well. And we know then there are some weakness in the sense that the mission of WMO is changing, is moving more in the climate area more than meteorological, hydrological area. And you can see from your map, then there is just now WMO is starting to have the process to define a grid, no, for measurements. Try to avoid to have too much measurements in one area and very few in other area, no. And this was a concept and complicated, but started, and it's the same problem we have. But before to reach to the data, the design, okay, the design, but the scope, we are always agreeing these days and before in developing roads, then social benefit is the key element from which to start. So the problem is we need to start from them and connect with the observation. This is the work we need to do before to go to the design and or to driving the design from the benefit and the needs. So in which way WMO can be useful as a big actor to help this part of the process? So meetings, convey the people, because RRR was a very huge effort, then take how many years, Radhika? 15 maybe?
Many years, I don't know how many, but yes, maybe 15 is a general.
Beginning of 2000. So
yes.
We have not 20 years to reach the same. We need to be a little bit faster.
And I think this is why I actually chosen to present what is available today with some examples, because I don't think this part needs to be, roads needs to take advantage of what is available in the RRR. Absolutely, it's not a perfect system. It has many gaps, and there is always something else to be done. But it's valuable to look at what is the level today. I think that WMO is looking at at bringing climate at the same level as weather. I wouldn't say that it's actually taking a stronger focus on climate. It's basically developing a system for seamless prediction. The discussion on delivering on societal benefits takes place within WMO, probably the same as any other community. That's why I presented briefly the joint publication with the World Bank on valuing weather and climate. That was very much developed to give a blueprint from an economic perspective. What does it take to meet specific requirements, and where investments need to be made at global level, especially in developing countries, and where data is really sparse. And in a way, you can look at the Arctic from with the same lens to meet the goals of various goals, and which goals should take priority. And I don't have an answer, and it's for this group to decide how to proceed. But it's important to take advantage of what is already available, including where things have not worked according to the plan.
No doubt about.
Thank you. Vito, oh, you're done. I see your mic is off. We'll move to Miko, please.
Yeah, sorry to take the stage again, but I think I could have expanded my question already earlier. I think because OSCAR was a very essential tool about a year ago when we made this kind of, for the SAON built international framework for Arctic observing assessment, that we build a value tree. And OSCAR was really the main tool to be able to fill the observation part. And then we already had this value tree built from the top down as the societal benefit areas. But I think a crucial part in between, which was not ready made, which had to be kind of done in a less kind of granular and sophisticated way in this exercise we did a year ago, where the modeling activities, something like weather services or ocean services, environmental information services, these are not very well mapped anywhere, as in what is the step they do, like which inputs do they have and what outputs. That would be quite useful for this kind of analysis of value chains that applications are needing. And those are then also a very important part for this kind of an essential variable. I do happen to know that for the ECVs, for example, of course, a very important community were the climate prediction modelers, that with them, certain aspects were easy to define and find out. So I think for Arctic variables in the roads process, we probably have the same situation. And yeah, so in SAON, we are of course trying to therefore see that where are these already kind of existing assets to draw upon. And I think I stumbled on at least the hydrological models that you also had in your presentations. You already had some kind of at least a report of who is doing operational hydrological modeling. But already when it comes to weather forecasting or climate prediction modeling, it's less clear if that is put somewhere in a kind of similarly organized database. Do you have there something that would interest me very much? Thank you.
I'm going to answer by saying that something relevant for the Arctic would most likely come out of the Polar Prediction Project when it comes to improved modeling for the Arctic. if you look at the definition of applications and the statements of guidance for each of the 14 or so application areas in WMO, there is documentation of the inputs required, but their relevance for Arctic regions, capturing the relevant information from the Arctic region, the polar regions in general, is not as well as you would like it to be. So that's why I included on one of my slides the invitation to connect and to work with a team that leads the Polar Prediction Project from Avi in Bremerhaven. The Polar Prediction Project is a project of WMO as well, of the World Weather Research Program. And together with other Arctic activities in the context of the Arctic Council, but led by the countries leading it, and Finland had the leadership. Iceland has engaged the international community for an Arctic Earth system modeling workshop and establishing an initiative in this sense. So this is all to say that the needs that you've expressed, Nico, are definitely clear to a broader community. However, meeting those needs is still work in progress, but I think there is hope. And yeah, I hope that within the time frame of roads, the other activities will make progress, and the collaboration between the various initiatives will address the gaps that you talked about. Thanks.
Looks like we are out of immediate questions, at least as from what I can see. So maybe this is the time to switch over to the questions that we are supposed to consider as part of this session of Working Group 5, and I think Jan René actually has them on the screen. I hope everybody can see that. So the overarching goal of session 2 is to identify and assess essential variables, assessment processes, and there were some pre-reads that I think most of you probably have done by now. And more specifically then, with respect to what questions we should contemplate here, because this is the working group that has the focus on the connectivity between the Arctic observing system that we are contemplating to enhance and the global systems that are in place and are also being enhanced as we are moving forward. We sort of have to figure out how are they actually playing together or not. And for example, the first question here is, what global networks are already operating in the Arctic? And if so, do these operate properly in the Arctic? Where are they trying to extend their global high priority set of measurements into the Arctic? And then which variables are easily integrated into global systems, variables that are important for the Arctic, and which are specific to the Arctic. So they might have a very high importance for getting a good view of how the Arctic system works, but might not be as important for a global network. So maybe if we spend some time on this question, we could get a sense of, you know, how well or how much synergy there actually is between observing in the Arctic and observing in the global domain. And just for to get oriented, how we have roughly a little bit less than 1.5 hours to go through these 5 questions that are posed here. And, you know, we don't have to focus exactly on one after the other, but I think this is actually a good one to start, because we had discussed a little bit during yesterday's joint session that often global observing systems cut off just before they are reaching high latitudes, and often it is really a question of infrastructure, sometimes a question of interest of those who are driving the global systems, and some of them were really had more focus on the mid and low latitudes and were not so interested in the high latitudes. But often it really is the logistical issue that makes global observing systems cut off at the high latitudes or before they reach the high latitudes.
Miko,
So
do you
Miko, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think this is, well, I would say that if we want to see what global networks already operate in the Arctic, and I think the meteorological oceanographic networks are for sure there as global networks. I think the question can also be in the way seen that some of the networks are actually not fully global, as in at least not having a global kind of stewardship for the operation. So if I'm, for example, looking at atmospheric composition, that's, for example, an area where we do have good national networks, good regional networks, but if you are looking, do we have just one global network together of these? It's not so clear, this picture. I think there's a lot of goodwill to try to get there, but you wouldn't be able to say that that's the case. And for example, that network would be interesting to operate in the Arctic immediately when we are seeing that there's more, for example, shipping traffic or other actions that bring pollution to the Arctic, because atmospheric composition is a
that's an
big part of. So that's why I think for this to be seen at, I think that question needs to be also put into place, that are all the relevant, interesting informations that we need for the Arctic, are they actually globally kind of organized already?
I mean, that brings up two interesting questions. One is, you know, some of the things that we are interested in really globally relevant, so that there would be a global equivalent. But the other question that you, or the other issue that you brought up first, Miko, is, you know, how many of the global networks are reaching into the Arctic, and even if they are reaching in there at you know, insufficient density, if we take them together, to which extent are they actually covering the overall need of observations in the Arctic? For example, if you spoke about the atmosphere, I could speak about, I mean, just picking another example, if you take the ocean, a lot of the global ocean programs did not extend beyond Fram Strait, typically not beyond the Scotland, Iceland, Greenland ridges. And the most recent example now is that, you know, we had the long sections in the ocean, which was the repeat hydrography CO2 program that's now flying under the flag of GoShip. And the question is, you know, is there enough coverage, or is there any coverage of GoShip in the Arctic? And if so, which fraction of what the Arctic community feels is the right amount of observation is actually covered by this extension of global activities into high latitudes? And Vito was, and then Eric. So first Vito.
Excuse me, we do have someone on chat that was prior to Vito.
Yeah, so
Molly. So Vito, okay, go ahead.
Sorry. We know that many times, even satellite, for example, I think about precipitation and clouds program from satellite, normally stopped, the most part up to now, stopped to 60 degrees of latitude as general activity. I don't know how many, but talking to my colleague, you are more expert of this area. So, but the question is not how much the global network are inside the Arctic, but a lot of side questions. The protocols and procedure they are defining are sustainable or useful for the Arctic. The standards, the traceability, so the protocols, how much? So I don't believe then we need to, the system is only one, it's global. The Arctic is no different from the other area, apart from the fact that you have the cryosphere always present, and you have a very peculiar regime. But from a physical point of view, it's the same. From biological point of view, is very complicated in the sense it's very sensitive, very sensitive to the situation, to the environmental condition. So, but these are the peculiarity. But apart, if you like to represent this system, is no different question if you like to represent mid-latitude or tropical. So the question is not this, is to find if this global network have suitable procedure and methodology, or how to integrate the peculiar procedure we define for the Arctic, and develop data in such a way that it can be combined, can be easily combined with the global data produced by the data produced by the global network somewhere else. So it's not just to go in and go in a global network, but it's more complicated, the question, because we need to see if the procedures are suitable, if the approach they are following is adapted for our scope and needs of the Arctic, and can our needs from the physical system, the ecosystem, but even from the society. So it can be completely different. I raise a question that is completely, maybe not too connected to science. Air quality, okay, or pollution is can be approached in the same way in Europe or in the Arctic? Not for sure. And so this means then whatever you are considering the global scale, you need to approach this considering the peculiar condition and needs from one area to another. You can simply say, okay, we take only one unique network, just implementing the same procedure, the same protocol, and the same approach.
That's well understood, Vito, but there are actually some scientific reasons why observations would be different besides the operational ones. If you look to stick with the ocean, I mean, the Rossby radius is different, so you would have a different resolution in the Arctic compared to low latitudes. But the question really is, which networks do we know that are operating globally that also include the Arctic? Because many don't. And so in order to get a bit of a sense of to which extent these two communities are actually working together, it might be good to identify a few. And I mean, there is a list that has been compiled.
Theoretically, all. In practice, very few or nothing. If you consider the number of stations at the end, the density of the station of this global network in the Arctic with respect to the density of station somewhere else, you can clearly understand that it's just a word to say global. That is the reality. The reality is this one.
That is true that we have fewer stations, but let's go one step back and say which global programs actually have any presence in the Arctic, and it might be a matter to adjust the density versus philosophically not even including the Arctic in their design and in their considerations of observing, the globe. Eric was actually.
Excuse me, we have Molly on chat, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I wasn't able to add this to the mobilization strategy, but there are, I guess my focus is also on kind of those issues and activities that are really of importance to coastal communities and to the people who live in the Arctic. And that tends to be more of a focus on the biological impacts. So things like fisheries, marine mammals, and the oceanographic and also terrestrial activities that might be impacting them, such as harmful algal blooms, which can be freshwater and ocean, or ocean acidification, warming, things of that nature. So there are new global networks that are developing. They have a small presence in the Arctic, such as the Global Ocean Acidification Network. There is a new global harmful algal bloom network forming. There's a lot of activities on marine debris. And I think it's important that when we look at some of the weather and ocean conditions and atmospheric, the meteorological, the climate conditions, that we not just look at them from a perspective of doing climate modeling, weather modeling, but we also look at their impacts on the biological resources. So for example, in the Bering and Chukchi Seas, we are seeing extreme ocean conditions warming. We're seeing more fresh water flow into those regions. They're impacting fishery resources. Fisheries are moving north. What impact is this going to have on the Central Arctic Basin, which is closed to fisheries right at the moment, right now, but what impact will it have in the future, and especially as sea ice continues to recede? So setting up in anticipation of some of those impacts down the road and making sure we have the observations in place, I think would be really critical. So I guess I'm just arguing that we not just focus on kind of the climate weather impacts and forecasts for these observations, but also the biological impacts, and that there are observing networks forming that, even though they're pretty nascent in the Arctic, they do have the potential to set standards, best practices, integration, and expansion in the Arctic.
Molly, that's a great point, and I think it's understood that the Arctic observing system has a different architecture and design than most of the other, especially the global observing systems, in that it cuts across many domains, and it is also frequently driven by phenomena, by processes. At the same time, I think what we try to work out as part of this these sessions of this working group is to see to which extent in the areas where we have global observing systems, can their reach into the Arctic fulfill a certain part of the observing needs that the Arctic community is coming up in the context of constructing that cross-domain integrated system.
No, I agree with that, Peter. I guess but the more we bring these other new networks in, even if they don't have as large of a presence in the Arctic now, I think that they could have a much larger presence in the future.
Yeah, that's what we try to figure out, and we want to promote. And in the end, we, after we had these 4 sessions of Working Group 5, we want to come up with a few recommendations. So, as we are thinking about recommendations, that might be one of them, to enhance the presence of global networks or the reach of the global networks into the Arctic, so that they can actually cover a larger fraction of the base observations, which then also would make it easier to connect, standardize, and all that kind of stuff.
Agreed.
So who was next? I think Jen, are you
Yep,
monitoring
so
both the chat and the raised hands?
Eric.
Just looking at the raised hands.
So I'm following chat. So if people do have comments, you can put them in chat, but Eric was next.
Thank you. first I would say I agree with what Molly said, but what I wanted to comment on is more the reach of global networks into the Arctic, and I will talk about GOOS. GOOS is not really there, but indirectly there, because as we heard on the presentation yesterday, we have AOS, which is part of IOS, the US part, we have the Canadian IOS, and EuroGOOS has. So three of the GOOS region alliances have activities in the Arctic, covering mostly the coastal areas. So what we miss is really the component that goes into the Central Arctic. And that's why the suggestions that have been in statements and also supported, as I mentioned yesterday, by EuroGOOS, is that the work towards an Arctic GOOS is very important in this process. And I really hope that the statement that Sandy gave on the chat yesterday, that she support the action, and I hope that it can be put into the recommendation that you mentioned, Peter.
Yes. And there is of course one Go ship. I think that also was on the chat, but I just remember that one Go ship section is going to the Arctic. That's a beginning, but it's clearly not enough. It's also not clear that the frequency at which this section is being occupied has been really adjusted to the needs. But yeah, we can sort of take the pieces that are already reaching in there as a starting point to say, if they can be enhanced, that would be a major contribution. And also it would be, in terms of content, a good connectivity between the Arctic and the global system.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is to really transfer the observations in the Arctic from being time-limited, research-funded, to raise the percentage of sustained observations from the existing 13% up to more like what we see for the meteorological, which is close to 70 or so. And that's a huge challenge logistically and financially, of course.
But it's a good point to keep for the recommendations, that, you know, not just the reach, but also the operationalization, getting them out of the research mode into something that's more steady and has a safer resource base. That's a great point.
If I could just interrupt for a second, I'm just going to assume that everyone is on computer and that there's no one on telephone. Is anyone on telephone only? You can unmute and let us know, because you would not be able to see the Zoom chat group. Okay, thank you. Radhika is next.
Yeah, sorry, just a second. Yes, I actually put on chat suggestion, and I think it was Sandy who mentioned yesterday about the potential to actually look at one phenomenon, let's say sea ice, and develop or test the process with a much more specific focus. I agree with Eric earlier that it is really difficult to expect that there is going to be a significant change on how governments fund observations with a long-term perspective in the Arctic. And the work of this process may be essential in helping with those decisions. But in order to keep the process going, it's important to take a stepwise approach and take a first step, potentially focus, for example, on sea ice, and see not only which observations are available, but also what are the impacts, what is the value added, and what is necessary but not available today. And in this process, also define what is essential in terms of essential Arctic variables, but also what is essential in terms of which partnerships and who needs to be influenced to change the observation design, the observing design and the systems. And again, I would encourage to consider not only in situ, but also the advancements that are being made in terms of space-based observations for the Arctic. And within the scope of the Global Cryosphere Watch, we are working right now, for example, with ESA to run an intercomparison of sea ice thickness and snow on sea ice from the perspective of operational services. So it would, not that would be important for WMO and GCW, but it would be helpful to actually decide to start with a kind of small as a test case and inform the process from there.
That's a good point, that we usually have to go stepwise, but we are going stepwise since 20, 25, 30 years. If you look at how fast the globe is changing, we also have to, I think, put some pressure onto the time scale over which we want to scale up and reach a reasonable coverage across all the domains. It's also fine, I think, to start with one domain, let's say sea ice, but sea ice by itself cannot give you the information that you need, because it has to be seen in the context of atmosphere, ocean, etc., also biosphere going into it. So as we are thinking about recommendations, we probably have to put something into that too, that we are looking at a place where change is expressing itself at higher amplitudes and at a fast pace. So, but this is the place that is undersampled. So that we are out of balance actually between the global system and the what you could call hotspot Arctic. So that, I think, if we are thinking about recommendation, that's one thing we could think about, to say, there is a gap between the global observing systems and the Arctic. At the same time, the Arctic is a hotspot that is changing faster than the rest of the globe. And so the question then is, why is there no investment in that? And why is it political? Is it logistical? Is it cost? Why, just going through these things, consider them a little bit and see what kind of recommendation we can come up with.
Thank you. Miko?
Yeah, I can very much pick up on that, because I would say that, at least from a European Union perspective and Copernicus or the EU space program, and there is going to be a very significant investment, for example, in the EU, from 6 expansion missions, which will get 5.8 billion euros or more EU funding in the next 7 years. From those, 4 missions are specifically targeted at polar questions. So 2/3 of that thing could be kind of like seen to be towards the Arctic, and as the main mission, like the most important, is the CO2 mission with several satellites. So I do see that in the space area, and from a European perspective, and I actually do know that other, let's say, countries in the world for space are also looking at capabilities that are relevant for the polar regions. So I wouldn't say that we are there so lacking, but we do also know that the satellites will not alone make so much of the cake if the in situ down there is not also kind of on par, that we can combine and really do the modeling well. So the year of polar prediction will definitely give there a lot of, let's say, a more specific and well articulated information on this, but just in principle, we are quite sure about this. But here in the in situ world, the issue is that all the global networks, for whatever, are already still national funded mainly, and national interests put it only in those kind of national interest areas, which unfortunately, for example, the closest to the North Pole area with sea ice is not really that hot on many nations kind of question. And so there's a definite problem that there is no territory in the Arctic as such that would clearly have a funding entity as a national state. But that's why I think we do have, and we can't give up on the fact that we also need to be able to, for the Arctic, observing in situ, to actually make a more kind of like international action for it. That it is asking from the closer and Arctic nations more, but it would also bring in the interests for the others, because it is quite clear that there's interest for other, let's say, countries as well. But how do we make that a good kind of like system, or make it easy to invest together? And that's not I haven't seen this in many disciplines. So so even if there's some kind of, we want to globally do something together, it then splits up easily in the North America makes something, and there specifically maybe even different countries make something different, but then Europe gets something maybe a little bit together, but it's never like the whole global, let's say, worlds put things together at the moment. And that's, I think, a really big thing that we have to hang somewhere up there, that this kind of pooling of resources and trying to make the most out of something needs to be organized.
Miko, you make two good points. One is we also should point, we shouldn't just point out where things don't work, but we should point towards action that actually will contribute in a major way to Arctic observing, such as the example that you brought on the satellite side and the European investment. The other one then, of course, is maybe, the question is, why don't nations invest in the same way in high latitudes that they do in low and mid latitudes? Probably they don't see as immediate a return or a benefit from it. And then we have to ask ourselves, is it up to us to make the case stronger? Did we not make the case strong enough? Because clearly what happens in the Arctic has effects not just on the Arctic Rim countries, but on the globe as a whole. And that is something that we could ponder a little bit. If we sort of, for whatever reason, fail to make them see that investment in understanding the Arctic actually does have benefits also for countries at low latitudes.
We could move to Ellen or Helen, please.
Yeah, I think I'm off mute now. That's a really interesting discussion that you're just having there, Peter. I'm just picking up on a comment that I had put in the chat room, and we sort of circled around it a little bit, but we have talked about how many of these global quote unquote observing networks have limited extent into the Arctic. And I just thought it might be interesting to consider, like, why do they not reach into the Arctic? I would suspect that the scientific questions are probably not that different. There may be, certainly are some things unique to the Arctic, but the services that would be provided would need to be more or less the same. I thought if we wanted to examine a little bit what are those limiting factors to have the global networks extending into the Arctic, then maybe we could start considering how can we go about improving or enhancing the extension into the Arctic. And I think some of this is what we were just chatting about too. Like, I don't know if Peter, you were saying, is it infrastructure needs? Is it resources, like financial resources or human resources, that we don't have people on the ground as much? Maybe we need to look at novel and other ways of collecting observations, and the discussion we just had about satellites is something that could be, sort of flagged a little bit. Do we need to look at ways of better integration of the existing programs to be able to capitalize on when there's investment? I don't know the programs well, but say Copernicus as an example, it expands. Is there ways of capturing work that's there to apply it more regionally across the Arctic? But I was just thinking that might be something that we'd be able to be coming up with some actions that could be in some recommendations. That's all I wanted to add. Thanks.
It's a great point, and you're right. We are circling around that. Maybe one thing to ponder is the global observing systems often extend into the southern hemisphere, also into sea ice covered areas. I mean, the sea ice cover is different down there, all that is understood, but not as much into the high north. And yeah, what, comments on that, thoughts on that would be good, because somehow I think it would be great to get a recommendation in there that is well founded why an investment should be made, and part of that, of course, will be seen by the Arctic Science Ministerial 3, making a well argued case for investment into Arctic observing, so that it becomes that it can move forward and approach the level of global observing systems in terms of coverage and meeting the needs for these systems.
If I can just respond quickly to that, Peter, it's Helen again. And I'd just be a little bit cautious in terms of recommendations about funding for observations, because I think we need to be, I want to use the overused word strategic about it. I think it needs to be particular kinds of funding maybe, or specifically with regard to increased integration and synergies amongst the systems that are there, but to make sure that we're taking every advantage of what is available, so that we can build on that. The discussion we've had about using what we already have on hand, it's not, a lot of it's not starting at square one. There's a lot there, just needs to be integrated better. Yeah.
No, absolutely, I would agree with that. We have to be careful how we make that case, but at the same time, I'm also convinced that we have to repeat that in the right context, because I think that's not the first time that we are on that topic of saying we are not limited by our knowledge of what should be observed and when and how it should be observed, but we are, in my view, really limited by resources.
We can move to Colin now.
Yeah, so I was thinking from the marine side, the question you're asking here, Peter, is a capacity thing. It's a ship's capacity problem. We have from the European side, 3 icebreakers, and one is modern from this Kronprins Haakon, but otherwise the other 2 are from the 80s, and they also have to serve Antarctic bases. So the reasons why we're not having observations in the Arctic is essentially the ship infrastructure on one side, and that's obviously coupled to funding as well. So there is moves in Canada, I believe, for new vessels, and certainly Russia and Asia has invested. But from the European side, it's worrying. ESA is investing so much into the Arctic, but on the European side, we have no facilities to ground truth that. We'll be dependent on other nations at least. But I think from a European side, there's a big need for ship capacity, and those global lines that are run as part of the Go Ship are also financed. Well, some of them are due to commitments into Antarctica. They make them do those transects, and that brings the ships down and across these ocean basins. And so that can be one of the reasoning why we have this this difference between the southern and the northern poles, if you like. So there's a big strategic draw, if you like, down to Antarctica, because there are bases that need to be maintained. And there's not the same arguments in the Arctic, in the same way at least. That said, I would argue that there is, for all the reasons everybody has brought up here, there's already good science and reasons to measure more in the Arctic, but there's also the fisheries argument as well. There's a demand, they've all signed it now, that we need to understand the situation in the Central Arctic before we allow any fisheries there. And to do that, we need to go there and we need to measure. But if we don't have any ships, we can't really do that either. So I think infrastructure is certainly a large part of it. And with that infrastructure would also come funding, I believe, to maintain a line or series of measurements as well. But without the vessels, it's kind of difficult.
That's a good point, Colin. And we always were struggling with icebreaker capacity, but at the same time, there is actually, you know, Polarstern will be substituted. I mean, they are struggling with getting the, I think there is a request for proposals out to build it. So, but I think the commitment is there to rebuild Polarstern. Polarstern right now is frozen in for a lengthy period of time. But there are other icebreakers that have been used in the past, and you know, there's the Japanese icebreaker, the Chinese had icebreakers up there. What helps us right now, although it's not a good trend, but what helps in terms of observing is actually that the sea ice cover in many parts of the Arctic is a 1-year type sea ice. But one thing that I'm wondering about is, why is nobody making the scientific point that it is high noon to actually send 1 or 2 icebreakers into the Arctic during winter? I'm pretty sure that we would learn a lot of things. Many we would come almost as surprises. I remember when in '86 we did the first section through the Antarctic sea ice in the Weddell Sea during winter. The wealth of new knowledge that came out of that was amazing. So, but coming back to your question, I think, yeah, the capacity is a little bit more difficult to align, but I think we probably could do more. I think often it is, how much does an icebreaker cost? How much does it cost to charter one? We know we do have the Healy, we do have Polarstern, we will have the success of Polarstern. There are Japanese, Chinese ships. They could be aligned. There are actually plans like the SAS, Synoptic Arctic surveys that people are putting together. That there is something else besides the capacity that prevents the observing from going forward at a faster pace and a better density. And I'm not exactly sure what it is. I'm just sort of trying to point that out and see how, as a group, we can come up with something that could be, turn into a recommendation for how to improve that situation.
May I answer to the Antarctic to Arctic? Raised my hand. I think it's very clear that the Antarctic has a treaty. Nations have stations there. So even that Finland is running a station in Antarctica is exactly that there's one Finnish station there. So that's why Finland has to take care of it. We need something similar, especially I think icebreakers is bloody expensive. So that's why it's not useful maybe to do a kind of continuous observation thing based on an icebreaker. It's good for research trips, for verifying something of a new process, but I would say that we definitely need to develop these different new stations that are chucked into the ice, they move in the ice, and there is actually in Job this kind of activity ongoing already. And when it comes to icebreakers, Finland has 9 icebreakers. They are just needed in the Baltic Sea still, but maybe in a few years we don't need them anymore, and then we have more icebreakers in Europe than anyone to do something with. And the newest one is just 2 years old. So I don't think that has to be the thing to discuss just icebreakers. It is more about how do we get this national investment kind of owning something in the Arctic, and I think that should be open to a global interest. So is there something that we can do that is similar to an Antarctic treaty that would lure people to want to do something in the Arctic? This goes, of course, beyond Seon and roads, because this is then political in a higher term. But I think the principle of this, that we somehow get a national pride in doing something in the Arctic to whoever is interested in this, and we would gain from that kind of investments into it. That might be something we should learn from the Antarctic side. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is clear that the Antarctic Treaty has helped in many ways to elevate the research activity around the Antarctic continent and on the continent actually. But how to come up with something like that is a very political thing. It's not that easy to, for us, it's almost impossible to push on that. But I think our currency is to make the scientific case. And maybe we have to think about it in that way. What are we losing if we are not getting the kind of view of the Arctic as the system evolves and is moving towards another state? You know, what would the impact be if we are not understanding that transition, and are there surprises in it? And part of that is modeling, but a big part, of course, is having the finger on the pulse of the system. And that argument so far has not yet penetrated to allocations of resources for an observing system that we had in mind as a scientific community, and actually reaching into the stakeholder community. There is more understanding there too now what the benefits could be, but it still doesn't translate into the kind of resources that we think we need to establish it.
Vito?
I believe then if you're starting to try to figure out some action in the Arctic similar to Antarctica, we completely move in a very wrong direction. The reason why was established the treaty in Antarctica is very clear. Claim over territory then is no of anybody are very far and need to be cooperating to be able to approach the continent. It's politically and geopolitically, the situation is so far, then no sense to try to look to the Arctic in a similar way to Antarctica. And was also a casualty in some way. After 57 and in 91 was an action to close the treaty and starting the game of share the resources, and then some parliament in Australia and other refused, and then they just prolonged because no solution. But okay, Arctic is another story. I don't believe then from this point of view we need to look to the Antarctica. It's another in a complete another situation, and it's impossible to replicate in the Arctic. No look to that to find a way to bring, and also the natural resources, the competition, also the military. No, I believe then we can remain on the science area and level and try to use the instruments, Science Ministerial, Arctic Funder Forum. So this sort of the cooperation agreement for the agreement for the increased scientific cooperation in the Arctic. Okay, these are the tools, the political tools we have in our hands, and these are the tools we need to use, not to look to the treaty in Antarctica.
Point well taken, Vito. But I think we are actually looking at the Arctic Science Ministerial since whatever when the first one was, a few years. We are looking at the Arctic Council since a long time. We are looking at all kinds of mechanisms that we can think of that would move on the political domain in terms of resource allocation. We have not been that successful yet with that. So the question is, where are we missing? Let's just focus on, is there something that we have not done that we should have done?
Don't forget that now you have the Arctic Funding Forum. It's a very powerful, it's a concrete transfer of the Science Ministerial in a sort of a body that can have the power, the money, and can take the commitments. So this is the forum. We are talking about resources and commitments, okay? And before we was looking to the Science Ministerial, but there are the ministers. But now after the second term, we have an instrument. They establish an instrument to engage the agency, the body then have the power, the money, and have the possibility to take resources. So this is, before to reach the political level, it's very difficult. But now we have people on which we dialogue anytime because we approach them for our project, etc. So we are now in a land, in a cart, much more easy for us to discuss with people than we know for other reasons. So this is the Arctic Forum that was fixed during 2 days ago. They was also discussing which is the name and acronym. Okay, this is a very powerful tool to collect resources and commitments. This is I think we forget this very important development.
That's a good point, but didn't we have a connection between the individual funders of Arctic work since a long time? I mean, to which extent is this new Arctic Funders Forum different in terms of being able to move certain pieces of the observing system along?
We need to try. We need to organize a point and need to dialogue. I can't say that it will be easy. We can't. Nobody of us can be sure 100% of the success, but at least it's something much more concrete, and on which then and they are there with the forum, bring it by the political level, European Commission, NSF or other. So they was there established and also they are guided by the Arctic Council chairmanship. So the chair, the moment the chair is Iceland. So this is really a very true political body. Then have the pocket. Okay, so this means that now we have something that can react rapidly to our project or proposal, concrete proposal. So, okay, we have no excuse. We have somebody that can answer yes or not, but to sound concrete. So we need to be concrete.
Okay, let's see if we can formulate something that would be, addressing that question of what the Arctic Funders Forum can do. We have about half an hour or so left. Just sort of looking at the 5 questions, and we sort of touched upon some of them. Question 3 is very similar to question 1. The question 2 is, to what extent can the roads process engage with and make use of existing practical structures for assessing EAVs? Examples are the ongoing GCOS review and the roadmap efforts in Taros. So that brings, of course, in the question, to which extent are the global, or which fraction of the Arctic observing systems can be reached by global observing systems, because there are very specific needs for the Arctic that we don't have a global equivalent. But for the ones where we have, for the instances where we have global observing systems, we probably should use established procedures in these global observing systems to define how an essential Arctic variable should look like if we are observing similar features as in the global systems through the essential variables. The question then is how to take it from there and expand it into the domain that is not that is very specific to the Arctic, does not have a global equivalent.
Radhika?
Thank you. I would like to suggest to maybe revisit the point that Mikko made early in the discussions about how to use applications that basically the middle of the value tree analysis to demonstrate the importance or the impact of where the observations are missing. But this is, so the second part of my intervention is really about the areas to demonstrate that the observations, the data is really missing. And this is where the multitude of activities in the Arctic need to be pulled together in terms of data to actually show these are the gaps relative to the lower latitudes. And for example, in WMO, because the value of the global NWP cannot be understated, but it really needs data from the everywhere around the globe. And while there are defined requirements for observations, it was very clear that unless there are mandatory requirements for observations to be exchanged in real time with a bare bone minimum, the goals of the performance of a global NWP cannot be achieved. And now there are steps being taken towards convincing countries that don't exchange the data to do so because of the demonstrated value of the failure to perform NWP models. So coming back to applications that support the benefits could become a tool to demonstrate the value of investment in observations. But observations alone without actually linking to the applications, it will be difficult to ask for, especially in the current context.
That's absolutely right. If we are sort of looking at that question and sort of take your example, an application. So let's assume there's an application that's well grounded, that also has been vetted with stakeholders, with indigenous people. So you really have established a need. The question then is, in order to provide the observations to understand and that phenomenon and this application, and to come up with suggestions for responses, how do you go through a process that would establish, probably in some priority order, what has to be measured in which way, how often, and where? So that is, you know, what roads will face, that evaluation, that process. And the question, because we are talking about this relationship between the Arctic system and global systems, to which extent can we actually learn from the process that the global systems went through to identify essential variables, to go through that process and develop the essential Arctic variables for these more specific problem or process oriented or application oriented tasks? Or do we have to do it from scratch? Is there anything that is easy to adopt? Can we adopt part of it? Or would it make more sense to actually say it's so different? And I'm just posing these questions. I mean, I have an opinion, but I wanted to see how people feel about that. You know, is it better to sort of develop it just very specifically to the with respect to the Arctic system?
We can move to Miko next.
Thank you. I do see this. So in the European Union context for the Arctic Geos call out there, it already is pre-baked for us in the sense that we are like targeted towards that we have to co-design with end users something useful for societal benefit. So it, I think, is given as such that we do have to follow the value chain from the end of societal benefit and go backwards or upwards. It's any way you want to see it, but let's call it backwards to observations. But I think it's very clear that in there you have many stops of somewhere you need models, somewhere you need at least products who are combining different sources of observations. And those are very key actors to be able to then define that, hey, we need that. And also the very useful definitions of something needs to be defined in a certain way so that it can be used in many places. And so I would definitely see that this intermediate kind of products, services, and then modeling, those actors need to be there. But I think the biggest first step, and we haven't been there before, at least I don't see that we have been very strong in interacting with end users, as research is definitely closer to the observation part than it is usually to the end user part. But this is, I think, the wonderful, nice challenge that we have to bridge it. And I do actually see that in, for example, this Arctic Observing Summit, we have nicely kind of actors who are close to the end user, and we have actors who are closer to observations. But I'm a little hesitant if I do see enough of those modelers and product service people in between, that there's probably our challenge, that how do we network to them to be able to involve them in these processes as well.
Let's collect a few voices, a few opinions on, how these variables that are essential for specific Arctic processes, but not globally that present, how they can or cannot profit from the process that the global systems went through.
Eric?
Yeah, I want to answer to your question, Peter. I think that in the Goose community, there had been done a tremendous work on defining essential ocean variables, physical, biochemical, and biological. So that work is more or less done. Some of them are more mature than others, of course, but they are there, and they are not different from say, other parts of the globe than the Arctic Ocean. So, and they are used in the different services that are already existing, whether it's research, but also for the operational services like the one I mentioned in my presentation yesterday for Copernicus. So here the big question is not to define the variables needed, but it's really to find ways to get observations, get data that can be used in the daily production line.
So you're arguing, and I would agree with that, to make use of the procedures that the community at large went through for those variables that are relevant in the Arctic. And then the question is, which can we adapt that process to the variables that are specific to the Arctic, but have not yet been contemplated in global context?
Yeah, I agree that I think we should rely on work that is already done, because it will delay the process towards an Arctic observation system to try to redefine the essential variables. It's more important to put focus on how to implement it, how to get an observation system up running. And I think that's where SAM should focus on the roads process.
Hey, Molly, sorry for calling on you, but in the context of what you are doing, you have identified, and I'm going back to your presentation yesterday, some of these processes that are very specific to the Arctic, and there must be a process underway to identify the essential variables, which would be essential Arctic variables. To which extent did you profit from the procedures that the global community went through for some of the global variables?
I think the benefit from the connection with the global processes is more ensuring that our standards, methodology, best practices are compatible, that we have good metadata, that we have good data QA/QC, that our data systems are interoperable.
How many variables did you have to come up with and define that were not in any of the existing observing systems, because you looked at something that was very specific to the Arctic and was not done outside? Was it a small fraction, or?
I would say it's a small fraction. It's a question of scale.
Okay.
It really is a question of scale. I would say our variables are very similar to others in the Arctic. It's just a question of local scale. And that's actually one of the things I was thinking about, because we also have all of these very small science programs all around the state that are operating very locally. They're collecting oceanographic observations, but they're not necessarily being done in a standardized way that you could easily integrate those observations. And that's one of the things I was thinking might be of value for us, and then maybe from the global perspective, is to do a better job of integrating those very local, geographically local observations, and see if combined they might have some larger benefit to the larger Arctic system.
That's a great point, yeah.
We have a question or comment from Jay Perlman.
I'd like to just continue the discussion, part of what Miko said and part what Molly said. The two points. One is that the ocean side of the essential ocean variables was driven in 2012 and 13 by the need to make the ocean measurements relevant to society. And so the way the particular EOVs were designed, they looked at both the impact on society and the ability of the technical community to address those needs. And when those were mixed and optimized, you ended up with a series of variables. I would suspect that that same activity now, where we were talking about going across the value chain, could be applied to the Arctic area. And so that's one comment I'd like to make, and we can talk about it in a second. The second comment was, if you look at the essential ocean variables, as Eric was mentioning, when we name them for very physical and then biogeochemical and biology. But in order to make them work, we had to have interoperability in a global sense where the measurements were similar. And in order to do that, we then went, and this is Goose, went to defining best practices in measurements or observations so that there were ideally, and it hasn't worked out fully, similar ways that things are being measured so they could be compared. And so I think not only do we talk about Arctic best practices or essential Arctic processes, but we need to talk about the ways they're measured and how we can make those uniform across the community.
So looking at that, what do you think, and same question for Eric and probably Molly, whoever is familiar with ocean ops, to which extent do you think ocean ops actually made progress to translate sort of standard variables like hydrography, current measurements, dissolved oxygens, etc., into a context of societal benefits, and were they actually able to sell that effectively?
Well, this is Molly. I think progress is being made, and I think at this last Ocean Ops, there was definitely a stronger emphasis on indigenous knowledge and connecting with indigenous peoples, number one. And then number two, I think there is more of an emphasis now on biology. I think the sense is that there's been significant progress made on the physical variables, the biogeochemical variables, but where we're really lagging behind is, for example, biodiversity variables, just something simple as how do you collect fisheries data and have it aggregated in a way that that is meaningful. Yeah, things of that nature. Jay, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I fully agree, and I would say that we're actually looking at defining out of Ocean Ops 19 potential projects that can address these things and be highly visible. That is a decadal scale project. And so I agree with that, yeah.
So in these areas of, and we talked quite a bit about, oh, Eric, go ahead.
I just want to say that I was not attending Ocean Up, so I will not comment on that, but I agree with Molly's point of view on the essential ocean variables and the maturity of them. So of course there's still work to be done, but that is done already in the goose context.
Mhm.
And the best practices that Jay mentioned is part of that, and Jay has done a great job on that.
But there seems to be progress on the physical side of things, and we talked quite a bit about that. In the context of the Arctic observing system, there is also, you know, we have to have quite a bit of emphasis on what you could call the human domain, you know, looking at socio-economic, socio-cultural evolution and what kind of observations you have to take there to capture this part of the system. We usually don't have a lot of people in groups like this one, and maybe even at the summit. I mean, we try to increase the number of scientists, indigenous people, people from the private sector, etc., to help with that piece, but we still seem to be, you know, lagging behind. What are your thoughts about this part? How to catch up on that? And you know, if you just look at the present situation with the coronavirus, you know, how does that actually, how resilient are communities in the high north against that, and what happens if it actually hits them? Because we know from the past, from other outbreaks of epidemics, that entire communities were wiped out. So how are we dealing with this part of the Arctic system?
We have a comment question from Vito.
Just a brief comment. I believe that we have a lot of work done and a lot of essential variables, a very nice scheme for the ocean, thanks to work of Goose. We can have the WMO, GCOS, other, I know, for example, for other community, High Mountains, GEO was producing in the some working group, a very nice work for some group of essential value. What is important is to consider the whole value tree. And so the connection with the way to combine them in order to fill and answer to the societal needs can be peculiar for the Arctic. So more than to, we was talking also today in a cross-cutting about on the work package 1, but granularity. So what means, so when we are approaching the funding, the policymaker or the funding, you need to present yourself as somebody that are proposing something to solve a problem. So this means probably to mix several of these variables. So this is the work on which we need to concentrate. So we can say, oh, well, it's important to measure temperature. Why? Because it's important for anything. And then other 2000, and the politics say, okay, nightmare, forget it, we move to the next one. So when we approach them, we need, okay, you have this problem, this challenge, and this is the solution, this is the system, then integrate some bricks. So the essential variables, or as defined by Marine, OWMO, etc., are bricks that we need to build, to build the house for the needs. And so this connection should be one part important of the game. And this is something that is peculiar for the Arctic because the needs are peculiar for the Arctic. So I know, look too much to peculiarity at the bottom because the system is the same, completely different from the societal point of view, but at least for the physical. But what is different is the top part, the connection. And this work was not too much done by many organizations or done for a little environment, little vision. In the Arctic, it's much more holistic. The needs of the connection is much more strong. As a physicist, I know that one of the peculiarities, the feedback process are stronger and produce strong answer in the physical reaction in the physical system. The same is for the ecosystem and for the society. They are very sensitive, and so the reaction can be strong for any little input. So I believe then the work is mainly to try to find at least some example and how to group them and to answer to some specific needs. Then we can show as example and work in this way. Then when you are talking to the politics, you say, okay, this is necessary for that. As complete, not just because temperature or surface albedo or radiation. This is I think is a very important part of the work for the expert group.
You're right. And the sort of making the case clearly has moved over the past years, decades actually, very significantly from making the case that you have to do whatever, an ocean section, an atmospheric station, an ice core, whatever, to really working out what is the societal benefit, and the votes process really is integrating that very, very strongly. It's in a way you could say that's the core of it. But still, let's assume we can make that case. Let's assume we convince them and they are willing to provide resources that would help to observe phenomena that would help solve problems or chart the future. Because we also have to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, or we cannot simply stick with problem solving, which is often the language that we are using. We also have to think about problem anticipation, meaning looking at preconditioning of systems and then taking steps to avoid problems, because otherwise we are just running behind problems that outpace ourselves anyway. But if let's assume we can make that case and there is a response to it, there is still the need for some areas, for some parts of the Arctic observing system to identify what the essential variables are. And we dealt with the physical system, also biogeochemical to a certain extent. But when it comes to the part that looks at the human domain that has to be covered, how are we doing there? And maybe we don't have the right composition of the working group here, but those of you who are working in that, how are you feeling about how far we are in being able to make a strong case for what is lacking right now, what is important? Because if we are not observing it, we are risking problem ABC. Are we actually sort of in balance between the individual parts of the Arctic observing system in making that case? That is a different question, but there is somebody, Radhika.
Yes, thank you. I guess from the experience in WMO, if it's possible to look at the economic value of the absence of data or the absence of information, that would probably resonate the most with the decision makers. So this is where the analysis, not only from a benefit, but from an economic perspective, would be quite valuable. And I'm not sure how to achieve that at this stage, but it may actually bring have the impact that this community would need.
But you're bringing up a great point, Radhika. So WMO, to which extent is WMO going beyond physical and maybe biogeochemical variables into sort of looking at, what do we have to know about the socioeconomic, sociocultural systems in order to actually get to the impact that we want to have?
We had recently a data workshop, and the discussions about the data exchange, the data availability were in essence at the core of that meeting. And one proposal was to look at the impact of the absence of data, for example, on the weather forecast, on the accuracy of weather forecast 3 days, 5 days ahead, and to see what actually is the society going to invest in addition because they don't have the right forecast. And this seems to be the model to look forward. And to some extent was in the publication that I mentioned earlier. So to look at the value that invested by the society because of the absence of right information.
And the kind of audience that you had, or the composition of that group, to which extent did it include, you know, stakeholders, or well, within, let's just stay within the scientific community, you know, scientists from the social sciences, possibly even humanities, but then also other stakeholders, or is it still somewhat dominated by scientists who are looking at the physical and possibly biogeochemical part of the?
It's still dominated by the geophysicists and more on the scientific research and operational perspective, but not necessarily including the social sciences. The Polar Prediction Project has a social sciences component as well. And that may be a good source of understanding how they are actually addressing those needs. And but in WMO, we've recognized that putting our recommendations from an economic perspective is a necessary next step. On how to do it, it's still work in progress.
So Molly, I see you're still on. I know, Miko, you're waiting, but just directly as a contrast, in your Arctic Ocean observing system, you know, in your presentation you showed that there is quite a bit of input from stakeholders, etc. How is the dynamics there? To which extent are you actually including people from outside the physical sciences, if the topic is defining the needs of observing for the system as a whole?
Well, we don't. We try to include social scientists, but our big emphasis is on decision makers. So we do try to include agency people, industry people, community representatives. So our focus is definitely on who would actually be using the information. So for example, it could be a harbor master, a port director. It could be local weather service operator. It could be representatives of commercial fishing. It could be someone representing a subsistence community, etc. So we do try to put, I think, a larger focus on the actual user.
I was actually going to comment on exactly this one as well, if I may.
Sure.
So we did this in Finland in 2005 already, the kind of what is the societal benefit of the weather service in Finland. And it was not done at all by any meteorologists. It was an economist who interviewed our customers. And the customers did give this kind of estimate of, if you don't have the information that we provide to you, how much will that cost you extra, or how much kind of winnings do you not get? Because we had both private, so we had winter road maintenance people, and usually those people who directly look at our data and then help the decision forward. These kind of people were investigated. And in Finland, it was 5.6 or 5.8, can't remember the number, times more, let's say, economic value because of our data was there compared to what we cost to do these. So I think that and we have in many, the World Bank has, with FMI, Finnish Met Institute, in several countries done exactly the same investigation for those countries. And it usually is always this kind of 5, 6, sometimes also 8 times more beneficial. But this is, of course, for weather service specifically. But I think the same principle is there. So you try to find those end users that are kind of utilizing the information that you provide, and then let them tell you how much the value is. And then when you do this with a big group, you will get a statistically kind of useful information. And I was actually going to come into one particular example that I'm very hard at working at the moment. We are doing for the Finnish forestry sector, because winter was always a key, let's say, opportunity to very efficiently and cheaply cut forests with big machines, because the soil was frozen or there was enough snow. So those conditions are, of course, now away. And we are now in exactly this co-design with one of those harvesting companies to discuss of how can we try to help. And they reveal already now that, of course, for them then to know soil wetness in a much more higher resolution and in much more kind of versatile soil conditions is something that they wish to have. And of course, we don't have those data sets. So I'm quite sure that we will find exactly by this very close to end applications, the kind of the data that we are lacking is pretty obvious. And then if we then put the experts into the view of what can we do to get closer, and usually it's always a combination of using somehow satellites and in situ observations, and sometimes even use those people who are the end users, that how can you provide us something that is helpful. But that's why I think the key is really to go from that end user point of view.
So we are reaching the end of this session. The next session of Working Group 5 will sort of, in a way, will overlap somewhat with what we have done here. It will extend more into the operational thing, like, you know, what kind of mechanism can we use to identify or to, yeah, identify and better define EAVs. So is there any pressing final question, comment, or is everybody satisfied to the degree that, you know, we can close this session and then we pick it up in a few hours during session number 4 of Working Group 5? I don't see anybody raising their hand, so taking that as a sign that we can bring that to a conclusion, let me thank everybody for a lively discussion. We all still have to get used to staring at a rectangle and doing that almost all day, so it's a little bit more challenging than being together in a room, but I think we are getting used to it, and I think it was an interesting discussion. We will try to extract the sort of, you know, major point out of that, and then we will meet again later today for session number 3 of Working Group 5. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Jen Renee?
Yeah.
Could you send me your email so I can email you the file, the chat file, or who do I give the chat file to?
Yeah, if you send it to me, that'll be fine.
Okay.
Did you get it now?
Yeah, I did. I'm just going to copy that before we lose this. Control C.
Yeah.
Great,
Will
thank
you
you.
post it right to the meeting notes, or, I mean, we could link the two of them together.
If you also, Jen, if you also send them to Ria, then she can add them directly into the meeting notes, but I would appreciate having them as well.
Okay, if everyone could just put your email, send me your email in the chat box, I will send you the file. So I get my screen. I don't get all the private conversations, but you will see some of my private conversations that I was having with members, which just says, will you go next?
The public ones should be sufficient, and we'll probably clean out the private ones then.
Great, okay. So if you just want to send me your email and chat before we click out of this meeting, I will include you in the email.
Yeah, can you send your emails, Jen?
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask you to put it into the chat box.
Yeah, sure.
Did you see it, Chen? I sent it to you privately in the chat.
Yeah, it's there. I got yours, Ria. I don't have yours. Who am I missing?
The two of us. That's
okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. Control C. Great. I will. So I will send. Hang on. Let me just make sure I've saved it one last time. Great. So I'm just gonna click out of here and I'll send it to you both.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
cheers.
you.
All of you.
Okay. Bye.
Talk again. Bye bye.